Hey, everybody, welcome back to the podcast. You're listening to the longest running superhero role playing game on Earth. I'm your host, the Game Master, and in this one, we're going to be talking about the death of Superman. And I don't mean the comic book where he fought Doomsday. We're going to be talking about two things. One is Infinite Crisis, which is where they killed off the original Superman. And the other is in real life, the death of Christopher Reeve, which took place on 10/10/2004. And so that's the date we use in our game for when our Superman finally passed away. So I was actually born the same day that they began filming the original Superman the movie. If I remember correctly, it took 19 months, almost 2 years for them to film that movie. And then it came out in 1978, and I was too young to see that one in the theater. Um, but when the sequel came out, Superman 2, which is a lot of people's favorite because it's got General Zod versus Non. That one came out the summer of 1981, and I was, I think, the perfect age for that. And I remember seeing that in the theater with my mom and loving it. And at that age, seeing that on the big screen, that was the most amazing thing I'd ever seen in my life. And I was hooked. I was going to be a fan for life. And the excitement that I had for the Christopher Reeve movies is why in 1985, when we went on vacation and I saw DC Heroes, the first edition box set, had a picture of Superman on it, and I wanted it. We'd gone to a place called the Continent in Columbus, Ohio, which is kind of hard to describe. It's sort of like an outdoor mall that looks kind of like a European village, like a little German village or something like that. In a way, it also kind of reminds me of some of the architecture you'd associate with like New Orleans, like the French Quarter. But at any rate, the point is that they had a an OSU bookstore there, and off to the side, they had a whole thing devoted to Superman, and they had a standee of the Christopher Reeve Superman, and it had been a really boring day. And when we went in there and I saw that, I ran over to that. I was so excited to see Superman. And part of that, by the way, just to put all my cards on the table, I've kind of mentioned this in some other videos. I didn't have a dad growing up. He's one of those guys that took off at one point, and it had just been me and my mom for a long time. She had to work all the time. My dad never paid child support or anything like that. So my mom was working constantly, and I spent a lot of time alone on a farm in the middle of nowhere that just so happened to look a lot like the farm from the old Christopher Reeve movies. And my town even ended in the word "ville" or whatever, the suffix "ville," kind of like Smallville. Um, and then at one point, when mom passed away, her parents were raising me, and they were elderly farmers that had, been got married during the Great Depression, and there were a lot of parallels, right? And so I loved Superman, but part of the reason I mentioned the dad thing is because not having a dad, I was always kind of looking for these father figures. When I was, flipping through the channels or whatever, I didn't know I was, but looking back now, I can say that I was. And so, like I mentioned before, I really gravitated towards Optimus Prime on the 80s Transformers cartoon because of Peter Cullen. And he gets that all the time at conventions where grown men come up to him and weep because, they didn't have a dad. And so he kind of raised him and he's acknowledged that, you know. And for me, Christopher Reeve had that same kind of quality. I thought he was very fatherly. And I mean, he is a dad because now we've got a documentary in theaters about his life and his death, and his kids, are part of that. So clearly he was a father. And so those natural qualities that I think he possessed as a family man, he brought that to the character. And then as a member of the audience, I was picking up on that. And so um, there was a while, for instance, in the 90s where uh, the WWJD thing was kind of a thing back then. And people started to swap it out for other acronyms. And so for me, at that time in my life, my thing I was saying to myself is, what would Superman do? And I would be in situations where, it was in a way kind of like fatherly advice. It was kind of weird, but at any rate, so then in the mid 90s, I want to say 1995 probably, I was actually on vacation in North Carolina surfing that day, and we quit surfing and we were tired and we went to this place. And the irony is, it was the first time I'd ever seen Superman ice cream. And I was still such a fan that I was like, heck yeah, I want Superman ice cream. So I literally had a cone of Superman ice cream. And we walked into this little shop just right off of the beach there. And the guy, I don't know if it's because he saw the Superman ice cream and knew what it was or what, but I remember he looked at me and he goes, "Did you hear what happened to Superman today?" Mind you, he didn't say, "Did you hear what happened to Christopher Reeve?" He said, "Did you hear what happened to Superman?" And I was like, "What are you talking about?" And he goes, "He got thrown off of his horse and like he might die." And I was like, "What?" And then the second time he said it, then he said Christopher Reeve, which I think is very interesting because he's not the only one that I kind of had that encounter with. But he said, "Yeah, Christopher Reeve got thrown off his horse today and they say he might die." And I was just shocked, man. I That just messed me up. And I was like, really? And we were supposed to do other stuff that night. There was some sort of a party we were supposed to go to or something. And I was not in the mood. I was like, no, thanks. I found a little mom and pop's video store and I rented all the Superman movies. Um, I took them back to, we had kind of rented this beach house thing where my girlfriend's dad worked for AT&T, and T, and one of the other guys there that was like one of the big wigs had this beach house that he was letting us use. So we go back there and everybody else did other stuff because nobody cared as much as I did. And it was the only time I used the VCR, the beach house, was I binged all those movies. And I just felt kind of numb and kind of surreal. And I remember thinking to myself, like, Christopher Reeve is not Superman. Like I kept telling myself that. Like they're separate. He's an actor. And I know that sounds weird. That probably sounds stupid to a lot of younger listeners, but I kept running into people. Like after the vacation was over and I went home, for instance, because as a kid, like I said, as a little kid, I loved Superman. If you look at old pictures of me as a kid, I was constantly wearing this old t-shirt. It's not like the kind we have today. It was like a really, really light blue, almost to the point of being white, but not quite. And then they had like silk screened or whatever the logo on it, but they used metallic red ink and like metallic gold ink. And then in the ink there was like glitter. And that'll probably sound weird to younger people too. It sounds like kind of a more girl thing or whatever. That was just a thing in the 80s for a little while, kind of a late 70s thing actually. But I loved that Superman t-shirt. And there were so many pictures of me wearing that, whether I was went to Disney World or whatever, I was wearing that Superman t-shirt all the time. So the old ladies of my town, they knew I was like a huge fan of Superman. And they kept saying the same thing. They wouldn't say, "Did you hear what happened to Christopher Reeve?" They all said, "Did you hear what happened to Superman?" And I thought that was very interesting. And then um, by the time 2004 rolled around, like I said, it was October 10th when he died. I had an apartment. I was married. I had a son at that point, who was about 6 months old, I guess, a little over that, almost a year old. And at any rate, I remember the phone ringing. And at this point, the comic book store that I owned had gone under. But the customers kept coming over to my store, excuse me, coming over to my apartment because we had a really nice swimming pool out back. So we'd been having a pool party all summer and, so on and so forth. And the customers had been hanging out a lot even after the store was closed. And at any rate, I remember the first one called me and said, "Did you hear what happened to Superman?" And I said, "No, what are you talking about?" And I thought they were going to tell me something about DC Comics, right? And instead they said, "Christopher Reeve died today." And I was like, "What?" And they're like, "Yeah, he died." And I was like, "How?" And they're like, "I don't know, something about his injury." And I was like, "Oh my God." And like it didn't seem real. And I'd get off the phone with them, I'd thank them or whatever, get off the phone with them, and like 5 minutes later, the phone would ring. It was a different customer. And so my phone just started ringing off the hook, like for the whatever, the first half of that day or whatever. And then that night, I was getting people calling me up saying, "Can we come over?" And I was like, "Sure." Like, the pool is closed for the season. It's too cold to go swimming now. It's, almost Halloween, but you can come over. And I had a living room full of people, and I realized it was kind of like a wake in a way. It was all guys my age who it just kind of messed with their heads that on some level, and it's like logically, that Christopher Reeve is not Superman, obviously, right? But there's some other level to it that I feel like in our culture, we don't really talk about this. And I don't know if I want to say it's like an emotional momentum when you're into something, like when you watch the movie and you're really into it and like you're carrying some sort of momentum with you. I don't know how to put that into words, but whatever that is, right? The flip side of the coin, people were bothered. The people I know, obviously, as is with everything I say on my channel, your mileage may vary. Maybe for you, where you live, nobody ever cared about Christopher Reeve, or maybe you hated the Superman movies or whatever. But for me and my circle of friends, we were like really weirded out. And and then I can't remember, it might have been Chris Crows, one of the guys sitting around the living room, and we were just talking about stuff like I remember the first time because they used to do like the CBS Friday night movie, Superman. That used to be a thing back in the day. And so we were all kind of going around sharing our memories of the first time we ever saw the Christopher Reeve movie or something like that. And I want to say it was Chris Cross. I don't know. One of my friends though said, "Are you going to retire him in your game?" And everybody got quiet. And I had not thought of it. And I was like, "Oh." And I totally got where they were coming from because in sports or something, if somebody is like amazing, they retire their jersey. Or saying, "We'll never again have another Babe Ruth or whatever." So I understood the concept for sure. And I wasn't opposed to it. I said, "I don't know. Um, I don't know. I hadn't given it any thought." And they were like, "Okay, fair enough." And I was really sad. We didn't play for a couple weeks. And I did have guys kind of say, is there going to be a game this weekend? And I was like, nah, I'm taking this one off, you know. So, maybe 2 or 3 weeks went by. And I decided, yeah, I was going to retire the original Superman. And so the way I handled it was I ran a game. And at the time, we were playing this space game that was kind of inspired by Firefly with Nathan Fillion. And I just had my guy in that game wearing one of those black armbands from the Death of Superman comic when he died fighting Doomsday. He had a black armband with a red S on it. And that was it. That was how I addressed it in that first game that I ran. And people saw it and were like, okay, it's canon now for us in our game. And so it was years until I would actually run how he died, right? I mentioned that some on this channel too, that just because a game is set in a certain year, it does not mean that's the year we played it. Sometimes we let there be a little distance between us and the event so that we fully understand it, and then we run it after the fact and plug it into continuity. So so the other thing going on around that general ballpark of time, and I couldn't tell you now if it was before or after, but I remember DC did this comic book called Identity Crisis. And at the time, I wouldn't say I liked it, but I put up with it. And looking back on it now, I think it was a really bad idea. And I have a couple of friends who work in the comic book industry, and I remember one of them, he posted on social media, which, man, what would that have been? Was that MySpace? I couldn't even tell you what we would have been using back then. But at any rate, he said, um, to DC, you guys, because for those who don't know, in Identity Crisis, they kill, who was it? I think it was the wife of Elongated Man. I always confuse her with the wife of the Atom. At any rate, it's one of those characters that's a little off the beaten path. It's not like a Superman or a Batman where they're like what I would consider to be an A-lister. But it's one of the other guys in the Justice League. You find out, spoiler warning or whatever, that Dr. Light, well, actually, you know what? I don't think I can say the word on this channel without getting in trouble with YouTube. He had his way with her against her will. Like he did something, I think it was a distraction thing. Like he commits some crime, so the Justice League like beamed down to go follow the trail of breadcrumbs that he left them. And then while they were off of their space station, he beamed up and he did this awful thing to her, right? And at the end of the day, what you find out is that the Justice League catch him in the act. And so Zatanna, they sort of hold this guy down, and Zatanna grabs his head. And her whole thing is she can kind of do anything as long as she can like say the words backwards. And I can't remember what phrase she uses now, but it's something like, you're not going to be this darn evil anymore. And I think she tells him to forget this happened or something like that. And they they make this reference then to the idea that, for instance, some of the Silver Age stories, like, because I think they referenced the Teen Titans fighting Dr. Light back in the day, and they do some little panel where he's acting goofy and he's like, and I would have gotten away with it too if it wasn't for you darn kids and your dog or whatever. And they were saying the whole reason that up until that point DC had been more family friendly. They're basically saying no, DC is extreme, and it was Zatanna the whole time, like like um can't think of the word now. Lobotomizing, that's the word. Lobotomizing the villains and turning them into G-rated versions of themselves. And all of a sudden, they broke free of whatever that was and they were going to run wild. And now the DC universe was going to be dark and so on and so forth, right? And then they did this another crisis. And like it wasn't like the thing where, for instance, we had the original Crisis on Infinite Earths in the mid 80s, and then they basically waited about 10 years before they did Zero Hour, which was the Crisis in Time. And, you know, they were doing one right after another. And this is one of a million things I hate about modern DC is just crisis after crisis after crisis after crisis, in rapid succession. I hate that. But at any rate, I feel like Identity Crisis was kind of them testing the water, and then they decided to do Infinite Crisis. And I might be getting stuff a little mixed up, but I think that's the one where they had kind of a prequel to it. I believe it was called Countdown to Infinite Crisis. And in that, Maxwell Lord, who had been part of a beloved run of Justice League in the 80s, and he had never been a real hardcore villain or anything like that. He was just kind of a rich douchebag guy that, kind of like financed the Justice League or whatever. He kills Blue Beetle. And a lot of people that I know now look at that moment as like the moment that DC jumped the shark. Is this moment where it's like, no, they never should have done that, and I think the reason they chose to do that to Blue Beetle, aka Ted Cord, is because he's what my wife and daughter would refer to as a cinnamon roll. He's harmless. He's nice, and there'd be no way to make him, like an edge lord version of himself, basically. So he had to go, you know. I think this was the beginning of DC just completely going off the rails. I think it's bad leadership on the company's part. I think it's stupid writers. I hated it. And so then the moment that was the straw that broke the camel's back for me was they do Infinite Crisis, and in that they bring back the original Superman. And when they did the Crisis on Infinite Earths and they rebooted everything and so on and so forth, they didn't have the heart to screw with the guy who is the whole reason we have comic books now. There's a reason they call them superheroes and not bat heroes or whatever, They're literally named after Superman. He is the father of the genre, right? And the writers in the 80s, I think, had way more taste and class, and they knew rightfully that this character should be respected. So they gave him his own little kind of private heaven, this little bubble. And then he was in it, and his wife Lois was in it. And then they had adopted two sons. One was Superboy Prime from a different dimension called Earth Prime. And if I remember correctly, the whole deal with Earth Prime was it was supposed to be our real world Earth, is where he was from originally, the original intent behind the character. And then because he got taken to the DC universe, then that's why we don't have superheroes on our Earth, right? And then the other character was Alexander Luthor of Earth 3, who was the son of that world's heroic Lex Luthor, because that's the world where kind of good and bad are reversed, and that world's Lois Lane. So those four were in this little bubble. And the first thing the writers did that I didn't like was they basically said, you know what? It's not heaven. It's their personal hell. They don't like it. They're trapped in this little place. And the original Superman has been trying to bust out this entire time. And I can't remember if that was the barrier or not. It's so stupid. It's just such a stupid concept. But the Superboy Prime character was punching some barrier associated with this, and every time he punched the barrier, it created some kind of a retcon or a reset to continuity for DC, which I thought that was asinine. And so they get out, and I don't really want to go. I don't want to do like a whole review of the entire comic because I don't like. I hate that comic. I hate it hard. I would instead, I guess, encourage you to read it yourself if you're interested. But it ends with the death of the original Superman. And excuse me, as if that was not bad enough, then a few years later, when they did Blackest Night, they brought him back as a zombie so that they could desecrate his corpse, you know? Uh, God, I hate modern DC. I really do. Well, so anyway, so we decided to do a version of that in our game. But from the very beginning, I knew it wouldn't work right. I couldn't do exactly what they did because they had their crisis reset their continuity and ours did not. They involve characters from other dimensions. So, for instance, Superboy Prime is from the Earth Prime dimension. There's only one Earth Prime dimension, right? So I can't use Superboy Prime in my story. So we started making changes. And in our game world, we already had a Superboy that predated the clone Superboy from the Death of Superman stuff. And by the way, this stuff where I'm saying that I think modern DC sucks, there was still stuff DC did in the 90s that I think sucked. And I think one of them was actually um, the clone Superboy from the Death of Superman. I really, really strongly think that was the writers were way older than I was. I think they had disdain for my generation, which is Generation X. And I think that in a way, the clone Superboy was the embodiment of everything they perceived about my generation that they hated. So he was mouthy, he had a stupid haircut, you know, on and on. And for my money, he's just super annoying, no pun intended. And so, granted, I have a chip on my shoulder when it comes to the Connell Superboy. And then they'd made him part Lex Luthor. And then he was like running around like I'm too cool for a superhero costume. I'm just gonna wear a black t-shirt and you know, blah, blah, blah. I'm so emo or whatever. I hated the character. And like I said, we already had a Superboy who was a nice guy, right? And so when those two Superboys met in our game, emo Superboy beat him up because the nicer Superboy had just done this thing where he'd lost all of his powers and he's had to start over from scratch, sucking up yellow sun radiation. So he got beat up. And really, in our dimension, and mind you, every dimension is different, right? Read Elseworlds comics or something to see how different the variants of characters can be from world to world. But on the Earth K dimension, Connell is just a huge prick, and he always has been. So he became the logical choice to fill the role for us of Superboy Prime. So in that comic, Superboy Prime gets his hands on the armor that the Anti-Monitor wore. We did the same thing, but with Connell, you know? Um, and then Alexander Luthor, you know, in the comics is a bad influence. He's kind of putting bad ideas in Superboy's head the whole time. So we did the same thing with our Luthor. And so at the end, there's a big knockdown, drag out fight. And Superboy Prime kills, excuse me, not Superboy Prime, it'd be Con-El, which, by the way, even in the comics part of the time, he is a villain known as Black Zero. So which is an Elseworlds thing, but I'm just saying, we were borrowing from that, and we were referring to him as Black Zero in our game too. But we said, yeah, he's the reason why the original Superman dies. He just beats him too badly when he's wearing the anti-monitor armor. And the original Superman, Clark Kent Sr., you know, softens him up. And then his son, and this is the 80s Superboy. We've got videos about his origin story and stuff. If you want to know that, ask me for a link and I'll be happy to post one for you in the comments or something. But at any rate, the 80s Superboy who recently married the 90s Supergirl, right? Who's the Earthborn Angel of Fire. He's the son of Superman. His older brother, well, so Superman had lost his powers in our crisis from gold kryptonite exposure. So Superman and Lois, their firstborn, was Clark Kent Jr. So he, in our game world, was the post-crisis Superman who died fighting Doomsday. And then later in the 90s, the original Gold Age Superman became the Electric Blue Superman. And then right before Y2K, he had this adventure with these things called the Millennium Giants where he got his old powers back. So yeah, so this is the original Superman that has his powers again is beat down bad. And so one of his other sons who did not die fighting Doomsday, the one that fought Doomsday was Clark Kent Jr. So this son is named Chris. And by the way, the guy who did the original Superman movies, Donner, created this character and named him after Christopher Reeve. And of course, modern DC, being the idiots that they are, they decided he should be a villain. Because if we have an homage to Christopher Reeve, let's by all means make him evil, right? Because that's not stupid or anything. But in our game, he's good. So this is who we're talking about. And in the comics, he's actually the son of Zod. We changed that because there was a pre-crisis Chris Kent from the 70s, and we kind of merged the two characters. And that one was the son of Superman. So we say ours is the son of Superman. And at any rate, so he, who was the 80s Superboy, fights Black Zero wearing the anti-monitor armor and beats him and throws him in the Phantom Zone. And he goes to his dad, and we get a really touching death scene. And the stuff that the dad says, then we lifted from the original movies, and then they say it again with the Brandon Routh Superman Returns movie, where the Brandon Routh Superman is quoting the stuff that Marlon Brando said in the original movie. We say a lot of that, where he's like, the father will see through the son's eyes, the son sees through the father's, something like that, right? You know what I mean, right? And then the last thing he says is kind of like, take care of Earth for me. And he dies, and we set it on the date then that Christopher Reeve died, because I care way more about the Christopher Reeve end of things than I do about Infinite Crisis, like way more. But yeah, that was how we handled it. And then after this, the son has to be Superman now. And I ran it where, well, one thing we did was we had those Kryptonian memory crystals in the Fortress of Solitude. So the son can go put one in, and then you get a hologram of the original Superman talking to him. And of course, that is a homage to all the stuff with Marlon Brando's Jor-El. You know what I mean? Where Jor-El is giving advice to Kal-El. We did the same thing, except It's the new Superman is playing sort of a hologram of the old Superman saying, "What should I do? Like, I'm not you. I'm not as good at this as you were, like this is really hard. What do I do, Dad?" And then he's giving him advice. And I kind of liked that. We were kind of a little bit like, well, yes and no, but in a way, we were borrowing from some of the stuff in the original 80s Transformers where Optimus Prime got replaced by a new guy named Rodimus Prime. The irony is, I'm not a Rodimus Prime fan at all, but um, aspects of that we kind of took. And part of that was the thing of the younger one saying it's really hard to live up to the legacy of the older one. I liked that part of it. Um, but yeah, we ran Superman 3, would be the character's name. DC, just the DC Heroes role-playing game, I mean, would just slap a Roman numeral 3 after the name. So yeah, Superman 3 was very humble, very modest. Um, had imposter syndrome, didn't feel like he deserved to be Superman. Um, tried his hardest, so on and so forth. But this, I don't want to make this video about him. I wanted this to be more about Kal-El and even more so, more about Christopher Reeve. Yeah, when he died, I was very sad. I knew a lot of people that were like really sad. This documentary that's I think it's in theaters right now. I have not seen it yet. I want to see it, but I just haven't yet. I've been busy. Um, I think it has a lot of guys my age really missing Christopher Reeve. And as of me recording this video, actually, because I record these in advance now, um, today is the day the first trailer for the James Gunn Superman Legacy movie just dropped. I was not real into the trailer myself. I won't go into that because that's not what this video is about. But I am seeing a lot of my friends on Facebook and stuff are changing their profile pictures to like pictures of Christopher Reeve, not pictures of this new guy. You know what I mean? So I think that's got people missing Christopher Reeve too, but that's just my humble opinion. Um, Let me know in the comments section if you guys want, if you're a fan of Christopher Reeve, tell me a little bit about that. When is the first time you ever saw one of those movies, or you get the gist, right? I would enjoy hearing your memories on the subject, though. And as always, we would really appreciate it if you took a second of your time to smash that like button to just help support the channel. It gets it out there, I think. I feel like more eyes see the videos with a bunch of likes than the videos that have like hardly any. Um, and as always, check to make sure you're still subscribed because YouTube loves to unsubscribe you and not tell you. But that's it for me for today. I hope you found this to be interesting. If so, as always, um, we hope you have a good one, and we'll see you in the next adventure.